what would you say then are the main elements of a successful animation film to make it really last?
Well, the one thing is we try not to do the same thing all the time. And it was, it's one of the things I try to convey in the book. It was actually really hard. I still don't know if I got it entirely. And that is that when you're trying to do something new and original, and like you get something like the way this team works together, and it works, and there's a good feeling like, okay, it all came together. You can't actually do that again. And that's the hardest thing is companies want to reach some sort of stable point.
Right.
Right? Like we get the process right and let's just get there. We finally figured it out. We know we had to make a bunch of compromises and all these things. We finally reached the balance point without fully understanding that the balance point is just illusion. That in companies, and it happens at different rates, but it always happens, is that the underlying technology is changing, different rates in different technology, but it's changing. The people who are using this process are they're growing older, they're getting families. You got new people coming in with new skills because they're taught different things. The expectations of the customers are different. The expectations of your partners are different. There is nothing in this picture that is stable. So if you realize this, then you say, okay, this premise of how we get to that sweet spot is something that continues to change and we have to keep working.
Wow.
Like that's the fundamental principle. It's like it's not going to be the same.
But there's an kind of an outline or a structure you like to put together for a great movie to come about, or is it always changing and evolving that kind of structure and outline?
Well, the thing is there is something basic but about a structure of a film, but it's not a law. It's like your guiding point. And if you're going to violate it, then sometimes you should. Then you should know why you're doing it. Okay? So with a movie, for instance, then a movie has a certain kind of structure. It's different from a Broadway musical, which has a break in the middle.
Yes.
As you know. And books have a wide variety of structures. So each one has a structure. Well, movies have kind of a structure, and they last from typically an hour and a half to nearly 3 hours. You just watched a movie last night, you said, and so there's a structure. In this case, it's part one of a two-part movie because they're essentially, having the structures going over a period of time. And likewise with the series, then the series have a structure and an organization around it, but for creatively making that structure. So we respect that structure, and some of those things work well and some don't work well. I mean, I've seen, as you have too, there are some series that start off brilliantly. In fact, they're so brilliant that they end up lasting longer, but they didn't actually have a mechanism in place to think about how it's going to end well. It's just sometimes you get to the end of the series, and I can think of two in particular that I won't name, where like you get to the end, it's like, that's it?
Right.
Hey, like if it was disappointing and they hadn't thought it through. And I can think of somewhere they get to the end, it's like, that's satisfying.
Yeah.
All right, this is well done. It was well thought out. So in the basic film, let's say it's a 2-hour film, the fundamental rule is in the first, say, 15, 20 minutes, you're establishing the rules of the movie, and you're also making it so that you're setting it up so that people like or care about the characters. And by the end of that first act, you need to know what the problem is. All right, so that's kind of like a general guideline.
Mm-hmm.
And so we do try to think that way. You actually care about these people. You know what the problem is. And you accept the rules. Now, the audience is very forgiving of your setting up the rules. And they don't want you to violate your rules because then it's just arbitrary. It's like, you just made that up at the end for convenience sake, or this incredible coincidence that takes place. People don't really like that. They can tell when they're being gamed or manipulated. So, but if they buy the rules, then they're okay. And I think the first time this was actually made clear to us was on our very first movie, which is Toy Story. Because we had this debate all this time because essentially the toys are talking with each other and then people come around, they all drop to the ground. So, I mean, think about it, all right? That's pretty weird.
Uh-huh.
Like, why does that work? And so in the end, the decision was, we're just going to do it and the audience will buy it because those are the rules of the world. And that's what happened. That basically, they knew that toys don't talk to the kids, and then they just fall down, they don't talk. So that's the rules of the world, the rule of the world. So the only time they did it, but it was more because of the little shock values, but it also didn't feel arbitrary, was when Woody turned his head around to the boy and actually, through the voice box thing, said something to him. The boy freaked out. Okay, so all this is keeping in mind, like, what are the rules of the world? How do they adhere to it? And then and for the subsequent films to it,
Right.
Those are the rules. That's what they stuck to.
Yeah, that's great.
So, let's say, and the point was, okay, is the audience will accept it, but they don't want you to screw with it after that unless you've got a darn good reason.
Right.
And then the rest of the movie is like, okay, it just gets worse and worse. Things get tougher and complicated, and they're trying to solve it, and you're rooting for them. And so that's where there's a lot of variability. And it's the longest act.
Sure.
And then at the end, it's like there's a way to get through this mess. And so at this point, you feel like you want to have the right resolution to the problem that was set up at the end of that first act. And so with Toy Story 3, for instance, then the issue, of course, was, okay, there's finally that time in their life when Andy is really going to college, right? It's actually going to happen.
So emotional.
And so now you go through that. And so once you've actually established what it is and what the relationships are and who's who, so that's the first part. Then you're going through these other things as you're finding about the other toys and this daycare center. And,
It's hilarious.
And then some things, like, they come back way out of the path, like the claw that's coming in. It's like, because you don't see it coming. And you like those kind of things where you don't see it coming, but it actually is appropriate to the story, and it draws way back on the first one. And it's just like, because it was funny, and it was, it helped with the things. Everything about it just like came together. And then they get back in the end, and then it's like, now he's really going to college. And so what do they care about?
And are we going to get in the wrong car or whatever it was? Like, aren't they going to get taken to the daycare or something at the end also? Or
yes.
Yeah.
So there's a lot of,
and then he forgot the box, and maybe they're not going to go anywhere, or.
Yeah, so it's like, and it's finally getting it together. And then when he actually says goodbye, it's like, okay, it's earned. It's earned. And then also for people whose children watched the first movie, and now their children who watched that movie are going to college, that's a whole level of meaning for them. All right. So these are all things where it's not like our people are doing it to like push buttons or something like that. It's like, okay, what means something to people? People care about. They have these emotional things when their kids go off to college. And how do kids think about their toys? And, it's like, okay, so, I mean, the thing is, I'm an adult when I see these movies, but I do remember these two very impactful movies on me when I was a kid.
Really?
Which are Walt Disney's, there's Pinocchio and Peter Pan.
Wow.
So, in this case, I see them in the theater, and they only show them in the theater like every 7 years. So they had this release cycle at the time. And so I hadn't seen them for many years, and I saw them again as an adult. And I remember these movies very clearly and the entire story. Then when I saw them as an adult, I was watching it, I realized that the things that I remembered in the movie were not in the movie.
Really?
I had made them up.
Wow.
That the child in me had actually gone back and filled in all this stuff. And this was in my head for all these years.
Huh.
And now I go back as an adult and say, oh, that's what it did to me when I was a kid. It stimulated something in me that was very powerful. And so I can't experience that anymore, but say, okay, but I can see what it does for other people. And if you do this right, what it means for them.
I could ask you stories about all these movies and all the emotions that came from this. This is beautiful. One of the things that I love about the book, Creativity Inc., which I want everyone to get a copy of, and the expanded edition specifically, is the innovation and the creativity that you guys created as a company. But also, you're telling me these stories now, and people are watching and listening about how you captivate audience with story, emotion, the right teams, the animation, the music, all these things, lighting, everything. But you also created an emotional connection in your culture at Pixar. You talk about a lot of these things in the book. And obviously, in the expanded edition, you talk about how you still don't have it all figured out. You're still figuring it out and evolving, and things are changing. And I don't think there's a perfect company that has everything figured out. But you were able to build a culture that emotionally captivated and had people bought into the vision, to the mission, to the values, and to what they're working on consistently. How are you able to do both? With the culture and the team that you had, emotionally captivating them, but also emotionally captivating in the movies you made to audiences around the world?
Well, the main thing was the belief that if culturally they got it right, then the other things would follow.
The team.
Yeah, the team.
Yeah.
It was getting that team right was the most important thing because, as I mentioned, I'm not actually the filmmaker.
Right.
And while I had this goal of making a film, I was never trained in filmmaking, and I probably know more about it just observing others, which I find fascinating. But for me, the fascinating thing was, okay, how are they affecting each other? How are they supporting each other? So like we had a research group, for instance. So we had different technical groups. There were people working on the films, which is sort of like really short term. What do we need to do to get this film done? There's some people who are supporting the software. There's some people that are building software in the future. So they had different time horizons. We sometimes will take on a big long-term project, which fairly high risk. But we also have a research group, and these are people they're all PhDs. They do some really interesting stuff, and they've got a really good leader, and then he's picked his successor to lead the crew. And I would meet with him on a monthly basis, just to catch up. But I have no idea what the rate of successful things they produced was. Never checked, never asked, didn't need to. The only thing I knew was that I wanted to spend time with them, and because they knew more than I did, it was just to always give the message that I valued what they did. Because I knew that the reason they were there was they wanted to make a difference for the films. So they would try different things. If they didn't work, they just stopped doing it and they move on to something else. I didn't need to keep track of anything. I can count on them and what they wanted to do to make the right decisions, because that's who they were. It's like, that's what you really want, is you want people in there, and they will figure it out, because it is hard. It's always hard. And it's like, I can't even answer their questions. And there are all kinds of questions, like in the production or the emotions and all that. It's like, what would it mean for them to ask me for it? If I were ever in that position, that would have meant I really screwed things up.
Wow.
And the thing emotionally I felt the best about the Pixar the entire time I was there was when we would have meetings on tough problems, and we would come away from the meeting and we didn't have the answers, but I felt so great because in those meetings, they weren't looking at me or to Jim to say, what are you guys going to do? Or what should we do? It's like, they owned the problem. It was their studio.
Yeah.
If it's theirs, then they act that way.
Wow.
That's the best place you can be. It's like they own it.
That's
it's
cool.
theirs.
Yeah. I wanted to ask you a question about money and art. When you were building the business of Pixar and wanted to make a movie, which was really the dream of yours for a long time, were you also thinking about making money and how to build a profitable business? Or was it more of just how do we make beautiful art and bring it to life using animation?
Well, when we started, and this actually started when I was at New York, when I was at the University of Utah. So like the foundation was laid, and this is really early on. All right, this is before there were chips or Intel microprocessors and so forth. And the basic principle was that things were going to change exponentially, and I did understand what that meant because we talked a lot about it. But I later became aware that most people didn't actually have a good concept of what that meant, because it's not an intuitive thing. I mean, that isn't something you learn on the savannas. So, but I was sometimes surprised to find that people didn't know that. So that was kind of built into an initial understanding. But it also meant that you had to build as if things were going to be different in the future. Now, the implication for this was that there was going to change the costs of things. So right away, even at New York Tech and then at Lucasfilm, I was thinking about this has to be economically practical. Mm-hmm. Because if you're going to do something big in the world, then it's big because it impacts a lot of people. It only impacts a lot of people if there actually is some monetary value or economics, because a lot of people are using it. Mm-hmm. Either a lot of people are buying it or they're watching it in this case. But it always seemed obvious to me that was fairly important. So when I got to Lucasfilm, and George wanted us to bring technology into the industry, we had friends who were competing with us, and they had the same goals that we did, and we knew it. And, but in the case of one of them, they bought a Cray 1 supercomputer, and the Cray 1 supercomputer cost $10 million. And we just did, as one of the co-founders of Pixar, when he came out later, but we were still at Lucasfilm, is Alvy Ray Smith, just did this sort of brief calculation, which was, okay, if we make certain assumptions about what we probably will need, then we will need the equivalent of 100 Cray 1 computers, not one.
Crazy.
And since they cost $10 million each, then and the cost of these 100 would need to be 1/10 the cost of just one, then the implication was that we needed to wait. But we did understand that it was going to change. So the implication was that at the rate of the changing in the chips, which is called Moore's Law at the time, based upon his observation about the rate of change, that was probably going to take 14 or 15 years before it would be economically practical to do. So this was actually an economic decision. It's like, nobody's going to use this if they can't afford it. And didn't take brains to see that. It was just, duh.
Sure.
So you wait. And but we also knew that we had a lot of problems to solve. And along the way, there were other things we knew we had to solve. We had to be able to make really complex images. And so one of the things we did in this chain of things to get ready was to come up with a new way of rendering really complex images. So this ultimately led to RenderMan, which is now the primary way they make images in motion pictures today with this thing we developed. But it was really saying what kind of complexity, and the state of the art at the time was 40,000 little polygons in a picture. And we said, well, okay, what are we going to need for a picture? We probably need 80 million of these polygons. So we had to think in a very different way. So the whole idea was to say, if the world is going to have a lot more power in the future and a lot more memory, and it doesn't exist now, then how do we think about it in preparation for that time?
Sure.
But it wasn't one of those things like we're being unrealistic, because we're marrying the complexity with the realism that we have to wait before it will have the impact. But this we can do. So we tried to be smart about why we spent the resources and how that affected the other steps along the way to get there.
Right.
And this turned out to have been like one of the milestone pieces. This is where we got the Oscar was for basically doing this very thing.
Wow.
Which had such an impact years later.
Amazing.
It was telling people that we had a new technology that was going to change filmmaking. So now it's a complete confidence this film is going to be a big success. There isn't anything like it. It's going to change the industry. And we've got the people that changed the technology, and they're doing the content. And that's what this company is.